Welcome, everyone. At least we don't have to go out anywhere, which is something on a night like that. We come to the second theme, which is early Irish spiritual consciousness and nurturing communities of public spirituality. You may recall last week we looked at how the Christian faith came to Ireland, the possible sources, a lay movement maybe, and we travelled on through the centuries and saw how that monastic church came to an end somewhere about the 12th century with what were called reforms, but it changed the whole face of the church and of Christianity in Ireland and brought in a new time and a new era. I want to look this evening then at the monastic consciousness that emerged and developed out of this early experience of the faith taking root in Irish soil. Now, consciousness, I think, is closely connected to culture and is shaped by it. And the monastic movement in Ireland, I think, as we saw last week, also was deeply influenced by the Egyptian model, but its consciousness was shaped by the cultural world in which it took root. So we're now going to, today we would describe that, I think, as inculturation, or maybe use the word contextualization. It's not a matter of reading back these more contemporary ways of describing doing theology and being a faith community, but something which in a sense has always been true. We now maybe have new words to describe the process and the praxis. The old Irish or Celtic world was politically decentralized. Ireland had 100 to 150 tuatha, or small rural kingdoms, in which the leader was the Rí, or king. Now, whether there ever was an ordinary, a high king of Ireland, is open to question. It didn't stop an 8th century poet writing of God as High King of Heaven, an image which does not suggest the divine was visioned as a kind of absolute monarch and all-powerful. The Rí was elected from among the people and was one of the people, which suggests an image of God maybe among the people and not aloof or removed from them. This does not mean that Irish society was not hierarchical or that we have a model of egalitarianism. People were ranked and there was a hierarchy of order. The Rí was at the top, still at the top, and close to the top also were the poets and the genealogists and the storytellers. And the ancient Celtic culture was an oral tradition. Nothing was written down, but the great myths and legends reflective of the great Greek myths and legends were spoken until the monks became present. And then the literary output of the monasteries was immense. The Irish monks were immersed in a pre-Christian milieu, in poetry and storytelling, were part of their lived experience and their consciousness. And so this huge literary output began, and from their pens there poured law texts and wisdom texts, sagas, histories, praise poetry, annals, genealogies, saints' lives, religious poetry, penitentials, and monastic rules. This meant that within monastic consciousness there was a metaphorical mindset. These monks were not literalists. Language was much too rich and words had multiple meanings to ever allow a linguistic literalist. There was no dichotomy between reality and fantasy, the world here and the world beyond. Myth was true in a much deeper sense than factual or strictly historical. The many lives that were written were never historical biographies. They were, we might call them theological myths, theomyths, of which it could never be said that it happened this way. It may or it may not, but it was true. In the world of consciousness, there is and was great value placed on imagination. Now, imagination has been described as at once a vision and a way of life. Imagination is more than the intellect, though it certainly does not abandon the intellect or the use of reason. It is the awareness that life and its experiences defy description and can only be expressed in the language of love and poetry. Imagination is nurtured through attunement to life and the world, thought and observation articulated in metaphor. So not surprisingly, monastic consciousness expressed itself in so much poetry. And maybe that is why the central and dominant part of their prayer and their liturgy was the poetry of ancient Israel, the Psalms, the classic poetry of the Hebrew Scriptures, expressing as they do the full range of human emotions and experiences, from ecstatic joy to the darkest night of the soul, in poetry, metaphor, and image, imaginative expressions of the interplay between the human and the sacred. The Hebrew poems were recited in the monasteries every day, voiced during the liturgical hours. Now, where else would a book of Kells or a book of Darrow come from but ripe and fertile imagination? Only imaginative monks would paint in two rats watching two cats fighting over the host in the opening pages of the Book of Kells. This is not just imagination. It's an expression of wild and extravagant consciousness and imagination. Theology is playful. We've maybe forgotten that God can be fun. Irish philosopher and theologian Noel O'Donoghue has pointed to four strands of monastic consciousness. There is a deep unity with nature. Monastic consciousness is elemental. The monastic lives, great expressions of theomyths, are full of animal stories. Saints befriend animals, or they are befriended by animals. There's a kinship with land, place, mountains, water, birds, trees, fire, and sun. Mary Lowe, in her fine book on Celtic Christianity and nature, dealing with the theme in early Irish and Hebridean traditions, entitles her penultimate chapter, God of the Elements. She acknowledges this nature consciousness and concludes, not all of its insights are of value today, but its strong sense of intimacy on many levels between God and nature and human beings offers a traditional but neglected Christian cosmology, which may well have something to offer. And indeed, it might. The second strand is a powerful sense of the omnipresence of the unseen world. The invisible world and the visible are inseparable and indivisible. George MacLeod, the founder of the Iona community, spoke of Iona as a thin place where two worlds intersect. Peg Sayers from the Blasket Islands off Kerry spoke of heaven being a foot and a half above the height of a man. Now, sexist language notwithstanding, we catch the sense of closeness and intimacy between two worlds, and the monastic consciousness lived within both. The third was a feeling of immortality, or maybe mortality. Monastic consciousness was aware of human finiteness, limitations, everything being penultimate, never ultimate. And perhaps that came with the strong sense of the omnipresence of the unseen world. But maybe too, it was because the world they lived in was a world of disease and famine and plague. And life could be short and was vulnerable. We live longer today, at least in the West, but maybe our privilege comes at a price to millions elsewhere on the planet whose lives are ravaged by war and violence and poverty, killer diseases, environmental destruction, and climate change. It may be that refugees and migrants have a greater consciousness of mortality, immortality than we have. The fourth was a profound love of learning. These monastic communities were places of learning, the early universities of Ireland. In the 6th century, they received scholars from all over Europe. And the saints and the scholars were also pouring out of Ireland to Europe. And the love of learning extended to many fields and not just biblical studies. The curriculum was broad and varied in the monasteries. The mind and imagination were open to knowledge and ever more knowledge. God's two books that they talked about, the Bible and nature, were inexhaustible sources of knowledge, and knowledge was not for hoarding, but for sharing and for the widest possible dissemination. So this is something of the Irish monastic consciousness, shaped by Ireland and its pre-Christian milieu, its culture, and its geography. It produced an Irish theology, Irish penitentials, and Irish social ethics. And in the second half, we will take an overview of what we might call the fruit of Irish monasticism. But let's go into these conversational groups, and we have a couple of questions that might be up in the chat. I'm not sure. Loretta will put us into groups to ask ourselves, have we lost the use of imagination in the practice of faith and theology? What do myth and metaphor mean for us? And then, do the four strands of consciousness have any meaning for us today? Okay, so we can take 25 good minutes and enjoy each other's company as well as the conversation. Okay, the fruit of Irish monasticism. I suppose Irish monasticism produced an Irish theology. In saying that, we can't claim that an Irish systematic theology emerged from the monasteries. It didn't. There were no institutes or Irish dogmatics as per John Calvin or Karl Barth. In fact, we might say that the Irish monks were not systematic in the way that they went about theology. They did theology, but it was not neat or organized. And perhaps where wild and extravagant imagination plays a central role, carefully organized theology is not going to be possible. Patrick in his confession does give us a creedal formulation with Trinitarian shape and some resemblance to the Apostles' Creed. But it may be that the greatest Irish theologian was Pelagius. But then he got on the wrong side of the emperor, and more to the point, he got on the wrong side of the Pope. He was significantly a lay theologian and not doing theology in a monastery. The other great mind to come out of Ireland was John Eugenia, a great philosophical, scientific, and theological mind. But some have questioned if his theology actually was Celtic or Irish. It was certainly not local theology in an Irish sense. But then John was one of those who operated on a very big map, and he was doing what we might even call cosmic theology. The theological patterns that do emerge from the Irish monasteries constitute local theology in that it was enculturated or contextualized theology. We have, of course, become more aware that theology is tied to culture and time and place, and that we do not deal really with some universal system believed by all people in all times and in all places. Today we have feminist, liberation, womanist, African, Asian, Dalit, and many other theologies. Religion has always had to make sense in a particular culture. The faith shapes the culture and is shaped by it. We live and think and imagine in a two-way street, and we experience a symbiotic process. The Irish monasteries were no different. The language and the imagery bear this out. Here's an early Irish example of a theological poem that shows the interplay between God talk and culture. I'd like to give a lake of beer to God. I'd love the heavenly host to be tippled there for all eternity. I'd sit with the men, the women of God there by the lake of beer. We'd be drinking good health forever, and every drop would be a prayer. So there you have it. Having a beer and tippling with God and women and men of faith is a form of prayer and communion. If anything, that is earth theology, a very this world theology. There's nothing esoteric or otherworldly about it. It is in the experiences of this life, in ordinary human sharing, drinking, eating together, that the human and divine communion is possible. God is very much the incarnational God. God is the God with a human face. And it is in the human experiences that we encounter the sacred in each other. Furthermore, as James Mackey has pointed out, theology is a very concretely mediated divine presence. The divine love and power come through people, Mary, holy men and women, the monastic communities, sacred kings, and the elements. The sacred presence is mediated presence, whether through persons or the material world. Incarnational theology is a theology of materiality, also of physicality. And so the monasteries then produced a sacramental theology. Elemental theology produces sacramentality. It also produces asceticism, and it did in Ireland, though we need to walk carefully and walk critically here. The monastic theology was not without its deep sense of the mystery. There is something about the sacred that we cannot be fully understood, grasped, or adequately expressed in human language. Consciousness that is steeped in imagination and metaphor knows that. No one expressed this sense of mystery more than John Eugenia. He may not have been from the monastery, but as a court theologian, a theologian in residence, if you like, he gave expression to the unknowableness of God. What we know of God, he said, is that we don't know. It is also the monastic sense that all our God talk cannot contain the mystery. Theology may be an attempt to give our human experience of the sacred intelligent expression, but it is always inadequate and incomplete. The attempt to say what cannot actually be said. And monastic theology lived in and from the sense of ultimate mystery. The Irish penitentials require us to tread carefully and critically. The penitentials undoubtedly were a major output of Irish monasticism, and they come to us with all their negativity and positivity. They were at the same time both innovative and repressive. They address the human dilemma, but in doing so, they remain enigmatic. The penitentials reflect the strong asceticism at the heart of Irish monasticism. There was something new, and what emerged from Ireland, it was something new, and what emerged from Ireland shaped a lot of Western practice and theology. The penitentials were a creative response to what was a pastoral impasse. Everything has a context. And by the 5th century, a serious theological and pastoral question was about what to do with sins that were committed after baptism. Well, there were minor sins and there were major sins, and the latter were requiring drastic solutions. And these major sins were so serious that people put off baptism until just before death through fear of committing the unforgivable. So after the Christianization of the empire, murder was a crime in the eyes of the state, and apostasy in a Christian state was no longer a problem. So of the three big sins, fornication became the number one drastic sin. But theology was becoming skewed, and sin was now being seen as a crime rather than the destruction of a relationship. The penitentials engaged theologically with this pastoral impasse, and they articulated sin as a disease requiring healing. Medical metaphors abound and were used, and the healing of the human disease needed cure by contraries. The cure for greed is giving. You respond to gluttony with fasting. The answer was not punishment, but medical care, which changed the whole image of God much more towards mercy and forgiveness. Penance also moved towards reparations. In the penitential of Finian, the church proclaims a divine mercy without limits. And in the penitential of Columbanus, sin is a sickness needing a variety of remedies and penances. The Irish penitentials give a whole new direction to the theology of sin and pastoral care in the Western Church. They shifted the emphasis from crime to therapy, from evil nature to illness, from judge to physician, from recovering a lost purity to becoming whole, and from life as a sequence of snapshots to one of a process. But there was also a negative side to the Irish monastic penitentials. Now, it should be said that these documents, the penitentials, were not for lay people. They were for clergy, monks, nuns. And it's reckoned that 45% of the penitentials deal with sexual offences. Now, that's high. It may indicate the particular moral struggles going on in monasteries and convents, or it may suggest a faith community that is becoming preoccupied with an unhealthy obsession with sexuality, in which sexuality and sinfulness have been too closely identified. If this is so, then the penitentials are predominantly male and misogynist in relation to women. Why a preoccupation with sex? The Western theological equation of sex with sin and sin with sex has made no small contribution to both a distortion of the faith and a distortion of sexuality. This is where we need a new anthropology to recover a positive humanness and to recover a positive theology of human sexuality. Monastic social ethics are rich, they're strong. The monasteries were engaged fully with their wider communities. They were immersed in the lives of ordinary people. And the great monastic leaders were themselves embodiments very often of social ethics such as justice, peacemaking, community, unity and cohesion, and mercy and compassion. And we see these ethics in the lives of Columba and Columbanus, Brigid and others. The flame of justice was said to have burned without interruption at Brigid's Kildare. The monastic communities were places of hospitality, refuge, sanctuary, communities of forgiveness and compassion, centres of environmental care, justice making, conflict transformation, peace building. Bridget's Kildare was known as the city of the poor. Columbus Dairy provided hundreds of meals a day for those without food. The discovery a few years ago of an intact mill at Clonmacnoise. They were constructing the M6 from Dublin to Galway when they hit something just below the surface. All construction of the motorway stopped, and they found an intact mill at Clonmacnoise, which shows a major production centre for flour and bread. Now, the date is the same as that of a serious famine and humanitarian crisis in the region, suggesting that the monastery was responding to famine relief. And it was on a very significant scale. The other interesting thing is that the design of the mill found at Clonmacnoise is the same as one earlier found at Nendrum, or built earlier at Nendrum, just outside Cumber in County Down. It may be that guys from Nendrum got a contract to go to Clonmacnoise and build a mill. Who knows? But these monasteries were doing ethics, serious and applied social ethics. And the practice of social ethics in the monastic communities was rooted in a very deep spirituality. It was the all-encompassing spirituality of the Trinitarian community, of the sacred in which the dance of love was the movement of life, and it was the spirituality of beauty. The feeling for the God of love in action and feeling for beauty opened up transformation and sustained ethical praxis. Of course, as we said last week, there was another story, a shadow side, at times all too real. Monastic communities could be violent places, in violent power struggles with each other. Sometimes the liaison was too close between the abbot and the king, and there was the corruption of wealth and the abuses of power. But through the ages, the church has been there also. We have our shadow side and our ambivalences. And yet there is enough in this early story of monastic Christianity in Ireland, perhaps to give us courage and vision to shine light into an era of dislocation and dissonance. I want to stop there, and we can have a plenary open conversation. On the resource sheet that you have, there were, I think, a couple of questions that might not be worth looking at, but theology is a very concretely mediated divine presence. Divine love and power come through people. And theology is about the material and the physical. What does all that mean for us? And how do we live with the ambivalence of the church? How aware are we of, in our Western European Christian history, how aware are we of a shadow side? And are we still obsessed with sexuality?